Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through a relaxing journey tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring more calm moments to your day. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments below. Now, get cozy, unwind, and let's begin. The house sat perched on the edge of a dense forest in Northern California, miles away from the nearest town. Surrounded by towering redwoods, the property was a secluded sanctuary, a stark contrast to the chaos of city life. The gravel driveway wound like a serpent through the trees, leading up to a modest A-frame cabin with large, fogged windows and a wooden deck that creaked in the cold night air. During the day, sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the moss-covered ground, while birds chirped in a harmonious cacophony. It was idyllic, a slice of solitude that felt almost otherworldly. Kara had bought the house a year ago, trading her bustling urban apartment for the tranquility of the woods. She'd grown tired of the noise, the crowds, the feeling of being constantly watched. Out here, she was invisible. No neighbors to overhear her conversations, no car alarms to jar her awake. Just her and the wilderness. At first, the silence had been unnerving. The absence of streetlights meant the nights were an inky black, the kind of darkness that felt alive, wrapping around the house like a suffocating blanket. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Over time, though, Kara grew to appreciate the stillness. It was a welcome reprieve from her old life, a place where she could finally breathe. She felt safe here, despite the isolation. The doors had sturdy locks, and she'd installed a state-of-the-art security system that sent alerts to her phone if anything, or anyone, approached the house. The few friends who visited joked about how unnecessary it all was. "Who's going to come all the way out here?" they'd ask. She'd laugh along, but a part of her liked the assurance the system provided. Her days were spent working remotely, the glow of her laptop illuminating the cozy interior of the cabin. Nights were for curling up with a book by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Occasionally, she'd step out onto the deck with a mug of tea, staring up at the endless expanse of stars. It was during these moments that she felt truly alone, in both the comforting and disconcerting sense of the word. But lately, something had shifted. The forest, once her refuge, felt different. The usual sounds of nature seemed muted, as if the trees were holding their breath. Sometimes, she thought she heard faint whispers carried on the wind, indistinct and fleeting. She dismissed them as her imagination, a trick of the mind in the eerie quiet of the woods. And then there were the footsteps. At least, that's what they sounded like. Soft, deliberate crunches on the forest floor, too rhythmic to be an animal. She'd heard them twice now, late at night when the world was otherwise silent. The first time, she convinced herself it was a deer or a raccoon. The second time, she'd grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the perimeter of the house. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no tracks in the dirt. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Kara's friends told her she was overthinking it. "You're just not used to living out in the sticks," one of them said during a video call. "City noise is constant, but out there, every little sound stands out. It's nothing." She wanted to believe them, but the unease lingered. One evening, after a long day of work, Kara returned home just as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon. As she stepped into the cabin, she was immediately struck by an odd smell, cigarette smoke. Her brow furrowed. She didn't smoke, and no one had visited in weeks. The scent lingered faintly in the air, as though someone had been there recently. She set her bag down and cautiously walked through the house, checking each room. The smell seemed strongest in the living room, near the fireplace. Kara's mind raced as she inspected the area, her heart pounding harder with each passing moment. There was no sign of an intruder, no displaced objects, no muddy footprints. Yet the scent persisted, nagging at her like an unanswered question. Shaking her head, she opened a window to let the crisp night air in, hoping it would dispel the smell. "It's probably nothing," she muttered to herself. though the words felt hollow. As the hours wore on, the cabin returned to its usual stillness. Kara tried to focus on a book, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange scent. She got up to make tea, hoping the routine would calm her nerves. The kettle whistled, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. Just as she poured the steaming liquid into her mug, a soft noise reached her ears. It was faint at first, barely discernible over the crackling of the fireplace. A creak, like wood under pressure, coming from upstairs. Kara froze, her grip tightening on the mug. The sound came again, louder this time. It was deliberate, unmistakable. Someone was in the house. Her stomach twisted in fear. She set the mug down carefully, her hands trembling. Grabbing her phone, she opened the security app. The live feed showed nothing unusual outside. The door was locked, the windows secure. But the noise, it was coming from inside. She crept toward the staircase, her heart hammering in her chest. Each step she took felt deafening in the quiet house. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, she hesitated. The creaking had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The word echoed up the stairs, unanswered. Kara stood there for a moment, paralyzed by indecision. Finally, she turned and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Armed with the beam of light, she forced herself to ascend the stairs, her every sense on high alert. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched out before her, cloaked in shadow. She swept the flashlight across the doors. They were all closed, just as she'd left them. But the air felt heavier here, charged with an unspoken tension. Her hand hovered over the doorknob of the bedroom, the nearest door. Taking a deep breath, she twisted it and pushed the door open. The room was empty, nothing out of place. She checked the other rooms, one by one, each yielding the same result. By the time she finished, her fear had begun to morph into frustration. She'd imagined it, she told herself. The long hours, the isolation. It was playing tricks on her mind. Sighing, she descended the stairs, her nerves still frayed. As she reached the bottom step, a cold draft brushed against her neck, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of cigarette smoke. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the empty stairwell, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Panic surged through her as the sound of footsteps erupted from the hallway above. They weren't soft creaks this time, but loud, deliberate thuds that reverberated through the house. Kara's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Gripping the flashlight tightly, she bolted toward the attic ladder in the hallway. It was her only chance to hide. She scrambled up the rickety wooden steps, her breath ragged as the footsteps grew louder. Reaching the attic, she pulled the ladder up behind her and closed the hatch as quietly as she could. The dim attic was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, shadows dancing in the weak beam of her flashlight. She wedged herself behind a pile of boxes, trying to steady her breathing. Below her, the footsteps stopped at the base of the ladder. Kara clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob as the hatch creaked. The intruder was testing it. She could hear their heavy breathing, a guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. Minutes passed like hours before the sound retreated, the footsteps echoing through the house once more. Kara dared to exhale, but her relief was short-lived. A loud crash came from the direction of her bedroom. She flinched, her heart pounding in her chest. From her hiding spot, she could hear the intruder tearing through her belongings. Drawers were yanked open and dumped, and the crash of furniture being overturned echoed through the house. Then came the sound she feared most, the thudding of footsteps returning toward the attic hatch. Kara pressed herself deeper into the shadows as the hatch creaked open. She heard the intruder climbing the ladder, the weight of their boots making the wooden rungs groan. Her flashlight flickered, and she desperately smacked it against her palm to keep it alive, her breath catching as the faint beam illuminated the edge of the attic. The intruder's silhouette appeared, and Kara felt paralyzed by terror. They stepped into the attic, the sound of their heavy breathing growing louder. The beam of their own flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping the space. She shrank back, willing herself to become invisible as the light passed inches from her hiding spot. The search was methodical, each step deliberate. Kara's heartbeat thundered in her ears, her muscles tensed for flight. But when the intruder flipped a nearby trunk, the sudden noise made her gasp involuntarily. The beam of light froze, turning toward her. "I know you're here," the intruder's voice rasped, low and menacing. Kara's grip on the flashlight tightened as the figure advanced, their shadow looming larger with every step. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the shattered remnants of Kara's bedroom window as the police combed through the wreckage. Kara sat on the front steps of the cabin, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands clutching a mug of untouched coffee. Her body still trembled, and her mind replayed the harrowing events of the night. She had managed to escape, barely. When the intruder lunged toward her, she swung her flashlight in desperation, striking them hard enough to create an opening. She scrambled down the attic ladder and bolted through the front door, sprinting barefoot into the forest. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, where a passing car slowed to help. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. But by the time they entered the house, the intruder was gone, leaving behind only chaos and a lingering sense of violation. The officers found no fingerprints, no clear evidence of who had broken in. Just the overturned furniture, the cigarette butt scattered near the fireplace, and a single ominous message scrawled in ash on the wall, "Next time." Kara shuddered at the memory, her grip tightening on the mug. She'd spent the morning giving her statement, walking the officers through every horrifying detail. But even as they assured her they would investigate, she knew the chances of catching the intruder were slim. Whoever they were, they had vanished into the woods as quickly and silently as they had come. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a prison of memories now, every creak and shadow a reminder of how vulnerable she had been. Kara resolved to leave, to find another place far from the suffocating isolation of the forest. But until then, she took immediate steps to fortify her home. She installed reinforced locks, motion sensor floodlights, and a camera system that covered every angle of the property. She even adopted a large, protective dog from a nearby shelter, finding some comfort in the animal's watchful presence. Despite these measures, the fear lingered. Nights were the hardest. Every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind sent her heart racing. She slept with a bat by her bed and the dog curled at her feet, her dreams haunted by the shadowy figure from the attic. In the weeks that followed, Kara tried to piece her life back together. She returned to work, kept in touch with friends, and sought solace in the routines that had once brought her peace. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder was still out there, watching, waiting. She learned to live with the fear, letting it sharpen her instincts rather than paralyze her. The cabin eventually sold, and Kara moved to a bustling suburb where the sounds of neighbors and passing cars brought a strange but welcome comfort. She no longer sought solitude. She craved connection, the assurance of others nearby. The experience had changed her, leaving her more vigilant, but also more appreciative of the safety found in community. As she locked the door of her new home one night, Kara paused, her eyes scanning the well-lit street outside. The shadows no longer frightened her, but she would never again take safety for granted. And though she couldn't erase the memory of that night, she carried its lessons with her. Trust your instincts, value your security, and never underestimate the darkness. Stranger in hotel. It had been an exhausting day, the kind where every second felt like a battle against time. Emily's muscles ached as she dragged her suitcase down the dimly lit hallway of the Rivercrest Hotel. The place had been a last-minute booking, the only option in a small town she hadn't planned to stop in. The beige walls were adorned with generic landscape paintings, their colors faded with time, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, the kind that made her quicken her pace without realizing it. Room 314 was at the very end of the corridor. The brass numbers on the door were slightly crooked, and the keycard reader blinked with an erratic red light before finally turning green. As she pushed the door open, the room greeted her with a faint musty smell, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. Still, it was a reprieve from the chaos of the day. She tossed her bag onto the bed and let out a sigh of relief. Emily took a quick glance around. The room was unremarkable. A single queen bed with a floral-patterned comforter, a small desk by the window, and a wooden dresser with a cracked mirror hanging above it. She locked the door behind her, triple-checking the deadbolt. Something about the quietness of the hotel unsettled her, but she chalked it up to exhaustion and paranoia. She needed sleep, and the bed looked inviting despite the outdated decor. After a quick shower, Emily changed into a pair of comfortable pajamas and sat at the desk to scroll through her phone. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, casting faint shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the window. She turned up the heater and tried to focus on her phone, but her mind kept wandering. Something felt off, a persistent itch at the back of her mind that she couldn't shake. The first sign came as a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A soft rustling noise, like fabric brushing against wood. Emily froze, her fingers hovering over the phone screen. She held her breath, straining to hear over the hum of the heater. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from the dresser. Emily's heart began to race as she turned her gaze toward the cracked mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in its reflection, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light. Gathering her courage, she stood and approached the dresser. Her bare feet felt icy against the carpeted floor as she crossed the room. As she reached the dresser, the rustling stopped. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the drawer handle. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered her. She yanked the drawer open, finding nothing but a dusty Bible and a couple of mismatched hotel pins. Letting out a nervous laugh, she shook her head. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered to herself. She turned back toward the bed, but the moment she did, a chill ran down her spine. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker. The sense of unease she had been trying to ignore came crashing back, stronger than ever. And then she saw it. A figure stood by her suitcase, its back turned to her. A woman, dressed in a long, tattered coat, her hair a mess of tangles. She was hunched over, rummaging through Emily's belongings, as if she had every right to be there. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen anyone enter. "Who are you?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, her body frozen in place. The woman didn't respond. Her movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as she sifted through the contents of the suitcase. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She reached for her phone, only to realize she had left it on the desk. Summoning what little courage she had, Emily took a step forward. "Hey, I'm talking to you," she said, louder this time. The woman stopped. Slowly, she straightened up, her movements unnaturally stiff. Emily's breath hitched as the woman turned her head, just enough for Emily to catch a glimpse of her face in the dim light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Emily stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if studying her, then took a step forward. Emily's survival instincts kicked in, and she bolted for the door, fumbling with the deadbolt in her panic. She didn't dare look back as she flung the door open and ran down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The hallway seemed endless, the fluorescent lights flickering as she ran. Behind her, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following her. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the elevator and slammed her hand against the call button. The doors opened with a ding, and she threw herself inside, frantically pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, she caught one last glimpse of the hallway. It was empty. The woman was gone. Emily slumped against the elevator wall, her entire body trembling. But as the elevator descended, a chilling thought crept into her mind. She had locked the door to her room. Whoever, or whatever, that woman was, she hadn't used the door to get in. When the elevator doors slid open in the lobby, Emily darted straight to the front desk. The night manager, A middle-aged man with thinning hair looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Help you?" he asked, his tone disinterested. Emily struggled to catch her breath. "There was someone in my room," she said, her voice trembling. "A woman. She was there, going through my things. She didn't use the door. How is that possible?" The manager frowned, his expression shifting to one of mild concern. "Are you sure? Room 314, right? The lock's electronic. No one can get in without a keycard." Emily shook her head. "I'm telling you, she was in there. I saw her." The manager sighed, setting down his pen. "Let's take a look. Maybe someone left the balcony door open or something." He reached under the counter for a spare keycard and motioned for Emily to follow him. Back in the room, the manager checked every corner, even under the bed and in the bathroom. "See? No one's here," he said, straightening up. But just as he turned to face her, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Emily and the manager froze. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Slowly, the manager opened it, revealing the woman from before, standing there as if she had been waiting. Her dark eyes locked onto Emily, and a chilling smile spread across her pale face. "How did you get in?" the manager demanded, his voice firm. The woman tilted her head, her voice soft and melodic. "I had a key, an old one." She held up a tarnished brass key that didn't match the hotel's modern locks. The manager's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. We switched to electronic locks years ago." The woman's smile widened. "Not everything changes with time," she said cryptically, before turning and walking away down the hallway. Emily stared after her, her stomach knotting with dread. The manager shut the door and turned to her. "I don't know who she is or how she got that key, but I'll call security." Emily nodded numbly, her mind racing. Even as the manager called for help, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. The woman's hollow eyes and chilling smile were burned into her memory. She wasn't just some stranger. She was something else entirely. Hours later, as the adrenaline subsided and the hotel grew quiet again, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She tried to convince herself it was over, that security would handle it. But every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside, set her nerves on edge. Unable to sleep, she got up to splash water on her face. The bathroom light flickered as she entered, casting eerie shadows on the tiled walls. As she leaned over the sink, her eyes caught something strange in the mirror. The edges of the glass seemed loose, uneven. Frowning, she reached out and gently tugged on the corner of the mirror. It shifted slightly, revealing a thin gap behind it. Her breath hitched as she pulled the mirror away from the wall. Behind it was a dark hole, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. A foul, earthy smell wafted out, making her stomach churn. She peered into the darkness and saw a narrow passage, lined with wooden beams and cobwebs. Her hands trembled as she realized what this meant. The woman hadn't used the door. She had been living in the walls. Panic surged through her as she stumbled back into the room. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. "There's someone living in the walls of this hotel," she said, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I saw a passage behind the mirror. She's been getting in and out through there." The operator tried to calm her, promising to send officers immediately. Emily locked the bathroom door and sat on the bed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her eyes darted around the room, every shadow a potential threat. She didn't know how long she sat there, waiting, but every second felt like an eternity. When the police finally arrived, she led them to the bathroom, her hands still trembling. The officers examined the hole, their expressions grim. One of them turned to Emily. "You did the right thing calling us. We'll search the premises and make sure she's gone." But as they began their search, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the woman wasn't just hiding in the walls. She was something far more sinister, something that didn't belong in this world. And Emily feared she hadn't seen the last of her. The next morning, Emily didn't wait to hear the results of the police search. Her suitcase was packed in record time, and she hurriedly checked out of the hotel, avoiding the curious stares of staff and other guests. The cold morning air outside felt bracing against her flushed skin as she loaded her bags into the trunk of her car. The Rivercrest Hotel loomed behind her, its darkened windows and cracked facade now holding a sinister weight. As she drove away, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Every mile that separated her from the hotel brought a fraction more relief, but the memory of the hollow-eyed woman lingered. Emily replayed the events in her mind, searching for answers but finding only more questions. Who was she? How long had she been there? And why had she chosen that room, that moment, to reveal herself? The experience left Emily shaken in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often, double-checking locks, and avoiding staying alone in unfamiliar places. The illusion of safety she had once taken for granted was shattered. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that haunted her. It was the realization of how easily her sense of security could be stripped away. For weeks after, Emily struggled to sleep, her dreams plagued by shadows moving behind mirrors and footsteps echoing in empty hallways. But eventually, the fear began to fade, replaced by a wary resolve. She refused to let the encounter define her, but she also knew she would never be the same. From then on, every hotel room she stayed in was thoroughly inspected, every creak and whisper investigated. And though she tried to put the Rivercrest Hotel behind her, Emily couldn't help but wonder if the woman was still there, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest to check in. Ryan Foster wasn't usually drawn to antiques, but the ornate, gilded mirror caught his eye the moment he stepped into the dimly lit store. Its frame was a mesmerizing swirl of intricate carvings, ivy leaves tangled with twisting serpents, their heads meeting at the apex in a snarling visage. The shopkeeper, a gaunt man with an unsettlingly toothy smile, claimed the mirror was from the late 18th century, though its provenance was shrouded in mystery. "It's a unique piece," the man had said, his voice smooth but strangely hollow. "The kind of mirror that seems to remember." Ryan laughed off the cryptic remark, chalking it up to a sales tactic, and purchased the mirror. He loved how it added a touch of old-world charm to his modern, minimalist apartment. Once home, he placed it on the wall opposite the living room sofa. As he stepped back to admire his work, the mirror seemed to shimmer briefly, almost as if acknowledging its new surroundings. Ryan dismissed it as a trick of the light. The first oddity appeared that evening. As Ryan sprawled on the sofa, flipping through his phone, he caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of his eye. Looking up, he saw his reflection, perfectly still, staring back at him. Yet something felt off. The room's reflection seemed dimmer, its colors muted. A small detail struck him. The clock on the wall behind him showed 8:10, but when he glanced at the actual clock, it read 7:58. "Weird," he muttered, shaking his head. "Probably just a delay in my brain processing what I see." But the phenomena persisted. Over the next few days, the mirror's reflection seemed increasingly out of sync. It began subtly, with objects in the reflection shifting positions slightly. A book that was on the coffee table in reality might appear on the floor in the mirror. Once, Ryan noticed a glass of water on the kitchen counter in the reflection, but when he turned around, it wasn't there. Unease began to settle in. Ryan tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of his eyes, or the mirror's old glass warping the image. Yet, as the days wore on, the reflections became undeniably peculiar. One evening, while watching TV, Ryan glanced at the mirror and froze. The reflected room was empty. The sofa he sat on, the coffee table, even the TV screen, all absent. It was as though the mirror depicted his apartment, but without him in it. A chill ran down his spine, and he turned to look directly at the room around him. Everything was in place. Returning his gaze to the mirror, the scene was normal again, his reflection staring back, but his heart hammered in his chest. "It's just an old mirror," he reassured himself aloud, though the words felt hollow. That night, he dreamed of the mirror. In his dream, he stood before it, but his reflection did not mimic his movements. Instead, it tilted its head, a slow, deliberate gesture, and smiled. A smile that didn't belong to him. He awoke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The image of that unsettling grin burned into his mind. Determined to put his fears to rest, Ryan decided to inspect the mirror closely the following day. He examined the frame, tracing his fingers over the carved serpents and ivy, but found nothing unusual. Then he peered into the glass itself, searching for cracks or imperfections. As he leaned closer, he noticed faint smudges on the surface, as though fingerprints had been pressed against the glass from the inside. The realization made him stumble backward, his pulse racing. The smudges disappeared as soon as he blinked, leaving the glass pristine. Ryan laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. That evening, he invited his friend Jason over, hoping for some rational perspective. As they sat in the living room, Ryan pointed out the mirror and shared his experiences. Jason, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's just your imagination, man. Old mirrors do weird stuff. Warped glass, uneven silvering. Nothing supernatural about it." Ryan wanted to believe him. He truly did. But when Jason stood to leave, something happened that neither of them could dismiss. As Jason's reflection passed by the mirror, it lingered a beat too long. Both men saw it. Jason's reflected self turned to face the room, even as Jason himself kept walking toward the door. The reflected figure raised a hand, as if in farewell, before vanishing entirely. The room plunged into an oppressive silence. Jason, pale and wide-eyed, muttered a hurried goodbye and left without another word. Ryan was left alone, staring at the mirror, his own reflection now perfectly ordinary but no less unnerving. That night, Ryan covered the mirror with a sheet, but even with it hidden, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And in the quiet darkness of his apartment, he thought he could hear faint whispers, as though the mirror was calling to him. The whispers grew louder as the days passed, an almost imperceptible murmur threading its way through the silence of Ryan's apartment. They followed him, a low, insistent hum that seemed to come from the mirror, or the thing inside it. One night, unable to bear the noise, Ryan ripped the sheet off the mirror in frustration. He glared at his reflection, his breath uneven. But instead of the familiar room behind him, the mirror showed something else entirely. It was a room, yes, but not his. This space was dark and decrepit, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper and its furniture draped in dust. The air in the reflection seemed heavy, oppressive, as though the room hadn't been touched by life in decades. Ryan stepped closer, his heart hammering. He reached out to touch the glass, and for a moment, he could swear he felt a chill radiating from the surface. In the reflection, his double stood perfectly still, watching him. The figure looked like him, same dark hair, same angular features, but there was something off. The eyes were wrong, too dark, too cold, like twin voids that threatened to swallow him whole. The doppelganger tilted its head, mimicking the gesture from Ryan's earlier dream. Then, to Ryan's horror, it began to move independently. The figure took a step back, disappearing into the shadowy depths of the reflected room. It gestured for Ryan to follow, a beckoning motion that sent ice through his veins. "What the hell?" Ryan whispered, stumbling back from the mirror. The figure didn't reappear. The mirror once again reflected his living room, ordinary and untouched. But the image of that other room and his dark reflection lingered in Ryan's mind, a phantom imprint that refused to fade. He didn't sleep that night, his thoughts consumed by the strange, haunting vision. The next morning, Ryan resolved to investigate. He scoured the internet, searching for any information on the mirror's history or the phenomenon he'd witnessed. Most of what he found was useless: superstitions, urban legends, and ghost stories. But one account caught his attention. A thread on an obscure forum mentioned a haunted mirror sold in a small antique store downtown. The poster described similar occurrences: reflections that didn't match reality, whispers in the dark, and the appearance of a shadowy double. The post ended with a cryptic warning: once it starts, it doesn't stop. Ryan sat staring at the mirror, his thoughts racing. He couldn't bring himself to cover it again. What if he missed something important? As if in response to his unease, the whispers grew louder that evening, rising to a crescendo just as Ryan stood to turn away. The sudden noise made him whirl back toward the mirror. His reflection was gone, and in its place stood the doppelganger, staring directly at him. It raised an arm slowly and pointed toward the back wall of the dark room it inhabited. Ryan frowned, his breath shallow. The gesture was deliberate, insistent, as though it was giving him a clue. His eyes followed the direction of the pointing hand and noticed a faint outline of what appeared to be a hidden panel in the peeling wallpaper. The doppelganger's lips moved, though no sound emerged, forming words Ryan couldn't decipher. Summoning his courage, Ryan whispered, "What do you want me to do?" The figure pointed again, more forcefully this time, its eyes boring into him. Ryan swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked away from the mirror and glanced around his living room, half expecting to see the outline of a similar panel on his own wall. There was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the dark room's panel was now partially ajar, revealing a hollow cavity within. The doppelganger stepped aside, gesturing for Ryan to look closer. Against his better judgment, Ryan leaned in, peering into the reflection's hidden space. Inside the cavity lay a small, ornate box covered in dust and cobwebs. The doppelganger locked eyes with Ryan and mouthed a single word, "Find." Ryan stumbled back, heart pounding. He scanned his own apartment again, searching for any sign of a hidden compartment. The whispers surged, urgent and insistent, guiding him toward the wall opposite the mirror. He ran his hands along the surface, pressing and tapping until his fingers caught on a faint seam he'd never noticed before. Taking a deep breath, he pushed. The wall gave way slightly, revealing a narrow, hidden compartment. Inside was an identical box to the one he'd seen in the mirror. Ornate, ancient, and covered in dust. Ryan hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the whispers ceased, leaving an eerie silence that pressed down on him like a weight. He pulled the box out and placed it on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might come alive. The mirror's reflection now showed only his living room again, ordinary and unremarkable, but Ryan knew better. Whatever was inside the box, it wasn't ordinary at all. Ryan sat in silence, the ornate box resting on the table in front of him. His heart pounded as he contemplated opening it. Yet something made him hesitate, a gnawing fear that whatever lay within would change everything. He glanced at the mirror, half expecting the doppelganger to reappear, but the glass was still. It reflected only his living room, ordinary and serene. The eerie calm unnerved him more than the whispers ever had. For hours, Ryan remained frozen, unable to bring himself to act. Finally, as dawn began to seep through the curtains, he reached for the box. The air in the room seemed to thicken, a tense stillness enveloping him as he lifted the lid. Inside was a single, rusted key, its surface pitted with age. Ryan frowned, turning it over in his hands. It was unremarkable, but its presence felt heavy, as though it carried some unseen weight. He looked back at the mirror. His reflection stared back, normal and unassuming. For the first time in days, Ryan allowed himself a small breath of relief. Perhaps it was over. The doppelganger was gone, the whispers silenced, and the mirror appeared ordinary once more. He considered throwing the key away, ridding himself of the last vestige of the mirror's haunting presence. But as he turned the key over again, a faint etching caught his eye, numbers barely visible beneath the rust. 12:45. He glanced at the clock. It was 12:44. A chill swept over him as the minute hand ticked forward. At precisely 12:45, a soft click echoed through the room. Ryan turned sharply, his gaze snapping back to the mirror. The surface shimmered faintly, like ripples on water. Then, it went still. Ryan waited, his breath caught in his throat, but nothing happened. The mirror remained mundane, a simple antique hanging on his wall. Slowly, he stood and moved toward it, his reflection matching his every step. He stared into the glass, searching for any sign of the doppelganger. There was none. With a shaky laugh, Ryan stepped back. "Guess that's it," he murmured to himself. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The mirror may have returned to normal, but the key in his hand felt like a promise, a door to a secret he wasn't ready to uncover. As he placed the box back into the hidden compartment, Ryan decided to leave it there, untouched. For now. And as he walked away, The mirror stood silent, its surface flawless and still. But if one looked closely enough, they might have noticed the faintest shadow flickering in its depths, waiting. Ben Carter loved his quiet, predictable life. His days were filled with the comforting routine of his work as a freelance graphic designer, and his nights spent in his modest but cozy one-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city. But one particular night shattered that tranquility in a way he couldn't explain. It was past midnight when Ben awoke to an unusual sound. A faint dripping echoed from the bathroom, each drop amplifying the stillness of the apartment. Groggy, he swung his legs off the bed and shuffled toward the source of the noise, assuming he'd forgotten to turn off the faucet. As he stepped into the bathroom, the cool tiles sent a shiver up his spine. He reached for the light switch, illuminating the small, pristine space. Sure enough, the faucet was tightly shut. Yet, the sound persisted. An intermittent drip, drip, drip. Confused, Ben scanned the room, his eyes landing on the shower. The dripping seemed to be coming from the tub. Hesitantly, he pulled back the shower curtain. Nothing. The tub was dry, its white enamel surface gleaming under the fluorescent light. He frowned, a vague unease settling in his chest. And then he saw them. Damp footprints dotted the tiles, starting from the center of the bathroom and leading to the door. Ben's breath hitched. The prints were unmistakably human, each one distinct with toes and an arch, yet slightly smeared, as though left by wet feet. He instinctively looked down at his own feet, bare and dry. A chill swept over him. "What the?" he muttered, his voice shaky. He followed the trail, his heart pounding. The footprints continued into the hallway, faint but visible against the polished wooden floor. They led to the living room, where they abruptly stopped in front of the sofa. Ben stared at the final print, his mind racing. "Am I dreaming?" he whispered to himself. To confirm his reality, he reached out to touch the damp print. His fingers brushed the cold, clammy residue, sending a jolt through his body. This was real. Too real. He stood up, his eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He retraced his steps to the bathroom, inspecting every corner. The door had been locked, the windows shut tight. No sign of forced entry. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was condensation? A leak? But how could condensation create distinct footprints? Ben forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to quell the rising panic. "It's nothing," he told himself. Just my imagination." But deep down, he knew better. He grabbed a towel and wiped away the prints, the dampness clinging to the fabric like a stubborn reminder. Then he returned to bed, though sleep eluded him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the apartment magnified in the stillness of the night. The thought lingered. If those footprints weren't his, then whose were they? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, dispelling the night's tension. Ben convinced himself that he had overreacted, chalking up the strange occurrence to some logical explanation he'd missed in his half-awake state. Yet, when he entered the bathroom to brush his teeth, his heart sank. The footprints were back. Determined to uncover the source of the strange phenomena, Ben decided to take action. That evening, he spread a thin layer of baby powder across the bathroom floor. The powder, he reasoned, would capture any new footprints, providing undeniable proof of whether something, or someone, was responsible. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at the pristine white layer for a long moment. Satisfied, he turned off the bathroom light and retreated to the living room, where he set up a small, motion-activated camera on the hallway table. If the powder didn't give him answers, the camera would. Hours passed. Ben sat on the couch, unable to focus on the book in his hands. His eyes kept drifting to the hallway, to the faint glow of the camera's indicator light. The apartment felt heavier than usual, the silence oppressive. Finally, exhaustion won out, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. A loud thump jolted him awake. He shot upright, heart hammering, and glanced at the clock. It was 3:12 a.m. The apartment was dark and eerily still. For a moment, he debated staying put, But curiosity and fear drove him to his feet. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The powder in the bathroom was disturbed. Ben's breath caught as he stared at the floor. A fresh set of footprints, smudged and uneven, trailed from the tub to the doorway. He crouched down, his flashlight illuminating the path. The prints were shallow but unmistakable, the powder clinging to the edges of each step. Heart racing, he checked the camera. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the footage. The hallway remained empty, the bathroom door closed, yet the prints had appeared. No movement, no shadows, nothing. It was as if the footprints had materialized out of thin air. Frustrated but determined, Ben tried again the next night. This time, he laid a dry towel across the bathroom floor, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. He positioned the camera to capture a wider angle, ensuring it covered both the bathroom and the hallway. At 2:45 a.m., a faint sound woke him. It was subtle, almost like a wet slapping noise. He bolted upright, adrenaline surging. Grabbing his phone, he switched to the live feed from the camera. The towel on the floor was moving. Ben stared at the screen, his breath caught in his throat. The edges of the towel wrinkled, as though something unseen was stepping on it. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. He replayed the footage, watching the towel shift again and again, but there was no figure, no source. When he entered the bathroom moments later, the towel was damp, its fabric bearing faint impressions of feet. The air was heavy with moisture, and the faint scent of salt lingered, like the ocean on a humid day. Ben sank onto the edge of the tub, his head in his hands. Every rational explanation he'd clung to was unraveling. The footprints, the powder, the towel, none of it made sense. He had no answers, only more questions, and a growing fear that whatever was leaving those footprints wasn't just an intruder. It was something far worse. The following night, Ben prepared again, but this time, something changed. He sprinkled the powder as before, meticulously covering the bathroom floor, but his instincts told him to pay closer attention. He positioned the camera and set his phone to alert him for any motion. When the alert came, Ben was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. He grabbed his phone and checked the live feed. The powder was shifting, slowly, deliberately. But this time, the footprints weren't human. They stretched unnaturally, the toes elongating into claw-like impressions. The shapes twisted and overlapped, forming spirals and patterns that Ben couldn't comprehend. His skin crawled as he watched the feed, the prints tracing intricate symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the camera's infrared light. Gathering his courage, Ben rushed to the bathroom, flashlight in hand. The symbols were there, etched into the powder as though burned into it. They were symmetrical yet chaotic, their shapes evoking an otherworldly precision. As he knelt to inspect them, the air grew colder, the faint scent of salt intensifying. The patterns began to fade before his eyes, as if the unseen force that created them was retracting its work. Ben reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing the remnants of a spiral. The cold was sharp, biting, and the powder disintegrated at his touch, leaving only a damp smudge on the floor. As Ben stood near the tub, the air turned frigid, far colder than the room had been moments before. His breath puffed out in a visible mist, and his teeth chattered as the oppressive chill settled into his bones. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural rumbling, not quite a voice but something ancient and guttural, like the echoes of a submerged groan. The noise grew louder, more distinct, resonating within the bathroom walls. Ben clutched the sink for support, his knees threatening to buckle. He stared at the tub, its stark white surface now obscured by a thin layer of condensation that seemed to spread with each passing second. The guttural sound shifted into whispers, overlapping and chaotic, as if 100 unseen voices were speaking at once. Ben leaned closer to the tub, his fear overridden by a terrible curiosity. The condensation on its surface began to form shapes, elongated, claw-like imprints similar to the ones in the powder. Then, they moved. The prints emerged from the tub's edge, crawling upward, as though something was trying to climb out. The whispers grew deafening, each one burrowing into Ben's mind like nails scraping against his thoughts. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the sound reached a crescendo. The The claw-like shapes vanished, replaced by a single word scrawled in the condensation on the tub's edge: leave. Ben bolted from the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, his pulse thundering in his ears. The apartment fell silent again, but the cold lingered, an unshakable reminder of what he'd seen, and the warning he'd been given. Days passed, and Ben's apartment felt less like a home and more like a trap. He couldn't bring himself to go near the bathroom, yet every night the whispers returned. No matter how tightly he shut the door or how far away he stayed, the sound seeped through, low, insistent, like a chant just beyond comprehension. The footprints stopped appearing, but their absence wasn't comforting. Instead, the silence in the bathroom felt watchful, as if the tub itself were waiting. Ben considered leaving, but every time he packed a bag, a strange compulsion held him back, as if the apartment had tethered him in place. One night, as he lay on the couch, the whispers grew louder than ever before. He sat up, heart racing, and turned toward the bathroom door. The cold seeped into the living room, and with it came a low, resonant thud, as though something massive had shifted inside the tub. Ben didn't move. He didn't breathe. The door remained closed, but the sound continued, a steady, rhythmic pounding, like the heartbeat of something alive. Then, just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Ben forced himself to his feet, trembling as he approached the bathroom. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold radiating through the wood. Finally, with a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. No condensation, no footprints, no sound. Yet the air felt heavier than ever, the scent of salt sharp and unrelenting. He turned toward the tub, half expecting to see something emerge, but it was pristine, its surface gleaming under the fluorescent light. For a moment, Ben allowed himself to hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had haunted him had left. But as he stepped back into the hallway, a soft, wet footprint appeared on the tile behind him, and then another, and another. They trailed after him, each step growing louder, heavier, until the whispers returned, low, mocking, and endless. The phenomenon never stopped. Forest Trap Story. The morning mist hung low, curling through the ancient oaks like ghostly tendrils as Emma urged her horse forward. The forest was alive with a cacophony of sounds, the chirping of unseen birds, the rustle of leaves as small creatures scurried about, and the occasional groan of branches weighed down by dew. This was the forbidden trail, the one the park signs explicitly warned against, and that was precisely why Emma had chosen it. Her breath fogged the crisp morning air as she tightened her grip on the reins. Artemis, her chestnut mare, snorted nervously, the soft thud of her hooves muffled by the damp earth. "Easy, girl," Emma murmured, patting the horse's neck. She felt the thrill of rebellion coursing through her veins, a familiar, intoxicating blend of exhilaration and defiance. Rules had always felt more like suggestions to her, and this hidden path called to her adventurous spirit like a siren's song. The canopy above was dense, blotting out the rising sun and plunging the trail into an otherworldly twilight. Shafts of light pierced through gaps in the branches, illuminating the swirling mist in patches that looked almost alive. The air smelled of wet earth and moss, a scent that was both grounding and unsettling. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the forest revealed nothing beyond the veil of mist. As they rounded a bend, the trail narrowed, flanked by jagged rocks and gnarled roots that clawed at the path like skeletal fingers. Artemis hesitated, her ears swiveling toward the dense underbrush. Emma frowned, scanning the area. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the forest's ambient hum. The mare's muscles tensed beneath her, and Emma could feel her unease. Probably just a deer, Emma reasoned, though her own nerves were beginning to fray. She'd read about this trail in an old blog post, a half-forgotten piece of local folklore about lost travelers and strange disappearances. It had been dismissed as nonsense by the commenters, but now, surrounded by the forest's oppressive silence, she wasn't so sure. The deeper they ventured, the thicker the mist became, clinging to Emma's clothes and dampening her hair. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed like silent sentinels. A low, distant sound reached her ears, a melody, faint and haunting. It was too melodic to be the wind, but too distorted to be any instrument she recognized. Emma pulled Artemis to a halt, straining to locate the source. "Who's there?" she called, her voice wavering. The forest replied with silence. Artemis pawed the ground nervously, her ears flicking in every direction. Emma's heart pounded against her ribcage. She reached for the small knife tucked into her boot, a precaution she dismissed as overkill when she packed it. Now, its reassuring weight felt like a lifeline. The melody drifted closer, wrapping around her like a shroud, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the mist, a shadow, indistinct but undeniably there. "It's nothing," she told herself, though her voice was barely a whisper. "Just the fog playing tricks." But Artemis wasn't convinced. The mare reared slightly, her whinny slicing through the oppressive quiet. Emma struggled to calm her, her own fear threatening to bubble over. As they pressed on, the trail became almost indiscernible, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog. The trees' twisted forms seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, their branches reaching out as if to grab her. Emma's confidence wavered, and she began to question her decision to ignore the warnings. She didn't want to admit it, but she was lost. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Then she saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in an unnatural light that seemed to pulsate. Relief washed over her, though it was tinged with unease. She nudged Artemis forward, desperate to escape the claustrophobic trail. The mare hesitated but obeyed, her steps tentative as they approached the clearing. What lay beyond the mist wasn't what Emma expected. The light wasn't sunlight, but something colder, more sinister. The clearing was eerily symmetrical, the grass unnaturally vibrant and unmarred by the frost that clung to the surrounding forest. In the center stood a structure, a circle of stones, ancient and weathered, humming faintly with energy. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen pictures of stone circles before, but this one felt different, alive in a way that defied explanation. Artemis balked, refusing to step closer. Emma dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft earth as she approached the stones. The air grew colder with each step, the melody from before now a faint whisper on the wind. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the circle, her fear battling with an overwhelming curiosity. She reached out to touch one of the stones, its surface icy and rough beneath her fingertips. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then, the ground shifted. Artemis' sudden halt jolted Emma back into the present. The mare's ears flattened against her head, and she let out a sharp, panicked whinny. Emma instinctively pulled back on the reins, her eyes darting to the trail ahead. That's when she saw it, a thin wire, almost invisible in the mist, stretched taut across the path at neck height. Her breath caught in her throat. Emma slid off Artemis and approached the trap cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. The wire glinted faintly, slick with dew. It was positioned with precision, expertly hidden among the underbrush. She crouched low, examining it closer. The ends of the wire were anchored to two sturdy stakes driven deep into the ground, their placement deliberate and menacing. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath. This wasn't some haphazard setup. Someone had put this here intentionally. Her mind raced with questions. Who would do this? And why? She felt a chill creep down her spine, not from the cold but from the realization that someone could be watching her. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Emma stood, her hands trembling slightly as she backed away from the wire. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement, but the mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. Artemis snorted, pawing at the ground, her anxiety palpable. Emma's unease deepened. The trap was no accident, and it wasn't meant for wildlife. It was meant for people. Her grip tightened on the knife in her boot as she considered her options. She couldn't stay here, but the thought of continuing down the trail, knowing there might be more traps, made her stomach churn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Okay, girl," she said to Artemis, her voice soft but firm. "We'll go back. We'll find another way." But as she turned to lead the mare away from the trap, that haunting melody returned, drifting through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. This time, it was louder, closer, and it wasn't alone. The melody morphed, its once soothing tones now warped into something sinister. Emma froze, her grip on Artemis's reins tightening as words emerged from the song. The lyrics were faint but unmistakable. "Turn back, you'll never leave. Turn back, you'll never leave." Her stomach churned as a wave of icy dread washed over her. Emma's breathing quickened, her chest heaving as her mind raced for an explanation. It had to be a prank, she thought desperately. Some twisted joke by locals who wanted to scare trespassers off the forbidden trail. But the voice didn't sound human. It reverberated in a way that made her ears ache, the words seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Artemis whinnied, pulling against the reins. The mare's wide, frightened eyes reflected Emma's own rising panic. She glanced around, the fog swirling thicker now, obscuring even the closest trees. Shapes seemed to move within it, dark and shifting. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "We're leaving," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." She mounted Artemis with clumsy urgency, nearly slipping as her boots struggled for purchase in the stirrups. The mare's muscles bunched beneath her as Emma tugged the reins sharply, steering them back the way they had come. The melody followed, its cruel refrain growing louder with each step. "Turn back, you'll never leave." Emma's hands shook, the reins slick with sweat as she urged Artemis into a trot, then a gallop. Branches clawed at her jacket, and the trail, what little she could see of it, seemed to shift beneath them, twisting in ways she didn't remember. The words of the song burrowed into her mind, her fear blurring them into a maddening chant. She dared not look behind her, certain she'd see something she couldn't bear to face. The oppressive fog closed in tighter, the melody rising to a fever pitch. Emma's vision swam, tears stinging her eyes as she whispered a silent prayer, begging the forest to let her go. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing and Artemis's labored snorts. Emma slowed the mare, her heart pounding as she scanned the trail ahead. The mist had thinned slightly, enough to reveal the faint outline of an opening through the trees. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. A new sound reached her ears, low and guttural, coming from the direction of the clearing. Something was waiting for her. By the time Emma reached the ranger station, her hands were still trembling, and her voice came out in ragged gasps as she recounted what she'd seen. The ranger, a stoic man in his 50s, listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each word. When she described the wire trap, his face darkened, and he immediately radioed for backup. "You did the right thing coming here," he said gruffly, handing her a cup of steaming coffee. Emma sipped it gratefully, the warmth doing little to steady her frayed nerves. "We've had reports of strange activity in that area, but nothing like this. Wire traps." He shook his head. "That's not just dangerous. That's malicious." A search team was dispatched that afternoon, and Emma stayed long enough to hear their initial findings. They discovered not just the wire trap she'd encountered, but several others scattered along the forbidden trail. Some were crude, others disturbingly sophisticated, all designed to maim or kill. The rangers speculated it was the work of a poacher or a disgruntled local, but Emma wasn't convinced. She didn't mention the singing or the shifting shapes in the fog. Those details felt too surreal, too terrifying to share. As she drove home, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch toward her, every whisper of wind like the haunting melody that had pursued her through the forest. That night, she locked her doors and windows, something she'd rarely bothered with before. Sleep didn't come easily, her dreams plagued by images of twisting trees and cold, lifeless stone circles. In the days that followed, Emma's perspective on her adventures shifted. The forest, once a place of freedom and wonder, now seemed darker, its secrets better left undiscovered. She found herself researching safety tips for hikers, investing in better gear, and sharing her story with friends as a cautionary tale. The thrill of rebellion had lost its charm, replaced by a newfound respect for the dangers that lurked in the wild. Still, late at night, when the wind howled outside her window, she sometimes thought she could hear it, faint and haunting, the melody from the forest calling her back.